Welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to dig a little bit more into the framing of this book. Behave explores the biology of violence, aggression, and competition, the behaviors and impulses behind them, and acts of individuals, groups, and states, and when these are good and bad. It is a book about the way in which humans harm one another. But it is also a book about the ways in which people do the opposite. The real question is, what does biology teach us about cooperation, affiliation, reconciliation, empathy, and altruism, among many others? One way to compare this perspective to what we've looked at in other books is to think about this simple question of, why do people not quit smoking? How do you go about quitting smoking? In Thinking Fast and Slow, what the authors might propose is that first you would need to activate type 2 processing, which would allow you to inhibit the automatic responses of type 1 processing, which are the desire that you would have to smoke. So you have to sort of actively work and decide not to smoke, or you also try to automate the process of not smoking. Now, in Nudge, what they would suggest is that you would need a helpful nudge, like graphic cigarette warning labels on your packages, which is what is happening now. A different perspective from Behave is that they would suggest, or Sapolsky would suggest, that it is not equally easy for everyone to quit smoking because of biological dispositions to addiction and the cognitive capacity to deal with stress and planning. And this is a very dichotomous way of looking at these three books. All of these authors are outstanding scientists, so that they know that their perspective doesn't preclude other perspectives. But I just wanted you to understand how the propositions of the books align or disalign with one another. So here's an example from Behave, where they talk about how different people differ in their ability to deal with addiction. And the big one that they talk about is childhood adversity. Across numerous species, major early life stressors produce biological dispositions, making people more susceptible to addiction. Abused children who develop PTSD have decreased volumes of hippocampus in early childhood, that sort of inner part of the brain. And by age 5, in one study, the lower the children's social economic status on average, the more reactive they are to stress, the thinner their frontal cortex, the poorer the frontal function concerning working memory, which we've learned about, emotional regulation, impulse control, and executive decision making, which is basically type 2 processing, this complex, hard decision making process. And this study suggests that these early childhood stressors have massive effects on even the anatomy of the brain. Now here's a traumatic example of this. In 1980s, a Romanian dictator banned contraceptives and abortions for women who had not given birth to 5 children. Soon after, institutions were filled with thousands of infants and children abandoned by impoverished families, resulting in severe neglect and deprivation. So these children were put in these massive sort of buildings, and they were malnourished. They were abandoned really in all measurable ways. There's a picture there of some of the states that those children lived in. Now, some were adopted and others weren't. This hit the news in the 80s, and many were adopted by Western families. Those that stayed in the institutions had decreased total brain size, decreased gray matter, white matter, less frontal cortical metabolism, less connection between regions, and this general size of individual brain regions, except for the amygdala, which was enlarged. Amygdala associated with fear and aggression. The general approach of this book is that first, you can't begin to understand things like aggression, competition, cooperation, and empathy without biology. Biology plays such an important factor in these types of decisions and actions that we take. You are just as much up the creek if you rely entirely on biology. So you'll see that it actually makes no sense to distinguish between aspects of biology that are, or behavior that are biological, and those that would be described as psychological or cultural. They're utterly intertwined. There's this ongoing debate, you might have heard it, nature versus nurture. And the truth is that they're intertwined. There's no way to disambiguate how our biology influences our society and how our culture influences our biology. They're joined. Okay, and so the one example that they gave of people who do not think about this connection between different disciplines comes from this quote by John Watson in 1924.
Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors.
All right, so John Watson was the founder of what's called behavioralism. It's this general concept that you can train people to be just about anything if you give them the right behavior. And what this book proposes is that we're not all born the same with the same potentials, regardless of how we are trained. Here's another example. This is from a man named Comrade Lorenz. He is an animal behavioralist, a Nobel laureate, and the co-founder of the field of ethology. Here's a quote from him.
The immensely high reproduction rate in the moral imbecile has long been established. Socially inferior human material is enabled to penetrate and finally to annihilate the healthy nation. The selection for toughness, heroism, social utility must be accomplished by some human institution if mankind, in default of selective factors, is not to be ruined by domestication-induced degeneracy. The racial idea, as the basis of our state, has already accomplished much in this respect. We must, and should, rely on the healthy feelings of our best and charge them with the extermination of elements of the population loaded with dregs.
Now, as many of you might have guessed, Lorenz joined the Nazi Party in the Office of Race Policy, working to psychologically screen Poles of mixed race, Polish German descent, to help to determine which were sufficiently Germanized to be spared from death. He had the belief that you can determine if someone is German enough, and if they are German enough, they will be good for society. And that, massively contributed to this type of thinking that motivated the Holocaust. It can be a massive problem when a scientist thinks about human behavior that can be entirely explained by only one perspective. So our first intellectual challenge so far is to think about decision-making in an interdisciplinary way. I've given you lots of examples of why that is important. The second intellectual challenge is to make sense of humans as apes, primates, and mammals, to figure out when we are just like other animals and when we are utterly different. So some of the time we are indeed like other animals. When we are scared, we secrete the same hormones as would subordinate fish getting hassled by a bully fish. The biology of pleasure involves the same brain chemicals in us as capybaras. And if you were to house two female rats together, over the course of weeks, they will begin to synchronize their reproductive cycle, just like human females as well. Sometimes we are very different from animals. We activate the classical physiology of vigilance while we're watching scary movies. We activate a stress response when we're thinking about our own mortality. There's no other creatures out there that can think of mortality and get a stress response. And we use the same musculature as does a chimp attacking a sexual competitor, but we use them to harm someone else because of their ideology. There's no other creatures out there that are getting in wars based on ideology. Okay, summary here. Again, our first intellectual challenge is to think about decision-making in an interdisciplinary way. And the second is to make sense of humans as apes, primates, and mammals, to figure out when we are like other animals and when we are utterly different.